So what's the whole point of sociology? Most of us see the world in terms of what's familiar to us, in terms of right in front of us. So sociology encourages us to look at the broader perspective and ask questions like, why are we doing what we do? And why do we act as we do? So sociology teaches us that we take for granted as inevitable or natural what is strongly influenced by history and society. So for example, as a medical sociologist, I have studied deaf culture and deaf societies. And one of the taken for granted natures of deaf culture is that people who aren't deaf generally consider deafness to be a disability. They consider it to be a disability that should be corrected either through the use of cochlear implants or learning how to speak and hear. Now, the big D, that means a culturally deaf society, does not believe that deafness is a disability. They believe that it's a special gift that makes them different from others, but it's not a disability. So that's the kind of thing that we take it for granted that, of course, deafness is a disability. Of course, everyone is going to want to speak and hear. But the truth is, there are groups in society that don't view it as a disability at all. So we need to understand the relationship between our individual lives and the larger social forces. So look at your individual life and the challenges that you're facing in your life right now, and the social forces that are pressing on you that are leading you to have this personal problem. So this is Marvin the Martian. And he is my favorite example of my guide to the sociological imagination. So I imagine that I am an alien looking down on society and saying, what makes sense to me? What doesn't make sense to me? Why are these people doing all these things? And so if you take yourself and put yourself in the role of an alien looking at society, and that you don't know anything about society except what you see in front of you, how are you going to make sense of it? So going briefly into some key sociological terms, we talk about social structure, social institutions, social change, and social interaction. So social structure, shows that social constructs are patterned in distinct ways. Social life is not random, and social structure is dialectical. And what I mean by that is that social structure impacts on the individual, but the individual also impacts on social structure. Social institutions, I touched on this briefly: marriage, school, family, church and religion, work, law, peer groups, sports teams, the government, the list goes on. And social change. Societies are not the same across time and space. What seems stable and solid for us is relatively new and socially constructed. I talked already about the process of reification, which is the idea of taking a socially constructed idea or thought and giving it power, making it seem real and natural. So in my research about medical diagnosis, for example, one of the most important studies published about medical diagnosis is the diagnosis of Lyme disease. Now, we all think, hey, Lyme disease is a real thing. If you get a tick, you get Lyme disease. It's a process, it's a medical process. But one of the most famous sociologists of reification wrote a book called The Social Construction of Lyme Disease. And he described how Lyme disease is, while there is a tick involved and while there is medical symptoms involved, the construct of Lyme disease is actually human created. And we have created the diagnostic principles around Lyme disease to make it into a real thing. Other examples abound. And again, I'm a medical sociologist, so I'll talk a lot about medical stuff. But for example, erectile dysfunction disorder. Erectile dysfunction disorder didn't exist 30 years ago until they accidentally developed a pill that would help with it. Then they had to create a disease to fit the pill. And now everyone knows that erectile dysfunction disorder is a real thing. It's a medical diagnosis. You take a pill and it helps. But 30 years ago, There was no such diagnosis. So that kind of shows you how reification and social construction works. So social interaction, again, I use Marvin here. So it's looking at the seemingly trivial aspects of everyday life, small events that are structured in a particular way, and small interactions that give structure and form to larger institutions. So, for example, the conversation that we're having today is a small interaction, but we're giving form to the larger institution, not only of Newlane, but to higher education itself, and ultimately into the societies that you're being integrated into.